without a dedicated lead. The power of Hyper Offense was that you could see it coming and still struggle to stop it. And as such, Focus Sash Stealth Rock leads didn't wind up going anywhere, as they are generally specialized and they demand specific strategies to stop them from executing. Bulky teams may counter Pokemon well individually, but tend to not really stop the initial Stealth Rock taunt lead strategy, nor the slam the gas and don't let up pressure of the offense to follow. No matter what stood in the way since then, buff to fog, heavy duty boots, the Hyper Offense archetype has prevailed in many guises, since it's not just about the success of the lead-off Stealth Rock, but the ceaseless pressure of the sweepers. If anything, Hyper Offense gained more flexibility with Team Creepy. You can lead off and instantly force the issue with Volcarona before the opponent had the chance to set up Stealth Rock, for instance, to say nothing of the already necessary skill of mapping out entire battles now taking on a new dimension. Previously, you'd be operating in the dark, trying to utilize your metagame knowledge to figure out the opponent's team before it was fully revealed, so you could plan things out accordingly. But now, you knew exactly what 6 Pokemon you were contending with. These were crucial details, but overall, the Hyper Offense blueprint would remain the same, as little switching as possible, preferably none. Interestingly, despite lacking the sheer power of Gen 4 and onward, Gen 3 OU adopted Hyper Offense influenced playstyles into its metagame after seeing just how suffocating such teams playing at such a fast pace could be. While the lack of equivalent trade meant the never switch philosophy couldn't be so literally transposed, the general idea was present in styles like the initial wave of Calm Mind spam, then a literal transposition of the sacrifice lead concept, previously non-existent in the metagame, in the form of Smeargle lead spikes offense, a style which also didn't switch nearly as much, if not calling on Gengar to block Rapid Spin. Even non-hyper offensive teams with Skarmory leads were more willing to stay in on Zapdos leads and lose almost all of their health just to reap the benefits of that early layer of spikes. The concept didn't really go further back in time though. While Gen 2 OU did develop some very fast-paced offense, it placed heavy demand and emphasis on aggressive switching, since the boosting options weren't nearly as strong or fast, and even spikes was limited to just one layer. Hyper offense has taken many forms in many metagames, but here's the basic framework of how no-switch hyper offense works in battle, regardless of tier or generation. 1. Stealth Rock, potentially taunt to prevent opposing rocks, sacrifice the lead. 2. Send in boosting sweeper and click the boosting move. 3. Attack until you faint, unless you are able to get multiple boosts. 4. Repeat steps 2 and 3. Note the distinct lack of switching, and also the implication that yes, your team very well can be a Stealth Rock lead and 5 boosting sweepers. Many successful hyper offense teams across the generations have been exactly this, but mostly the lack of switching. If your booster is about to be taken out, stay in. You're better off getting a clean shot with the next booster. Your opponent only benefits if you give them free hits like that. Plus, before your first booster goes down, it should have done some serious damage, which your next boosters will then take advantage of. In the first 2 turns of the game, set up Stealth Rock. If you're not rocking on the first turn, it's because you're taunting the opposing lead so they can't set up Stealth Rock. Afterwards, you simply send in your first booster, use your boosting move, and attack until your Pokemon faints. Then send in the next booster and repeat this process.
Thanks.
In the words of the Wu-Tang Clan, can it be all so simple? Well, yes and no. And here are some key aspects to keep in mind. Sometimes you will want or even need to switch. You just have to make sure you're not taking extra damage for doing so. Your Pokemon may be naturally bulky, but as soon as you switch and take more damage, no matter how seemingly minuscule, you are very likely going to compromise that Pokemon's ability to set up, and if not sweep, at least do as much damage as possible before going down. This kind of compromised setup kills momentum. Even something as weak as an Intimidate, Weaken, Mach Punch can put your Pokemon in the KO threshold of an opposing attack, especially if something like Sandstorm is active. If you're switching Gyarados into an attack, it better be Earthquake, preferably without sand in the picture. Wakanberry Gyarados can survive most of Zapdos' Thunderbolts, but only so long as it's at perfect health. Generally, unless you lose nothing by making the switch, don't do it. As soon as you try to switch defensively, you're on the back foot. The absolute last place to be for a team that lives and dies by the constant barrage of momentum creating offense that's more than the sum of its parts. Here's an example. Note the only time the hyper offense user switches is when Starmie is spamming Recover and cannot be broken by Metagross at this time, as Sandstorm is not active to cancel out its leftovers. Seeing as Sandstorm isn't active at the time, if the Dragonite that it switched to does so on a turn that Starmie recovers, it won't take any more damage switching in than it would have if it came in after a KO. Other than that, the hyper offense user didn't switch at all, and overwhelmed the opponent through non-stop pressure. And for those wondering why it was Dragonite that was switched to against the Starmie, it's because most Recover Starmie in Gen 4 don't have Ice Beam. Not literally all 5 of your non-lead Pokemon needs to be a boosting sweeper, but can instead pile on the pressure with more immediate damage. Threatening to run away with the game the way sweepers do is a superb form of pressure, but with a playstyle that's all about fast damage, Being able to dish it out while not needing a turn to boost, i.e. being even more immediate, can be even more helpful in this regard, really not giving the opponent any room to breathe. That said, though their superb power makes them tempting for such a role, choice items are generally to be avoided, unless you know you can deal with whatever you're going to allow a free turn after the initial KO. Generally, since you can't safely boost up against a hyper offense team, the hyper offense team doesn't need to concern itself with a revenge killer. If a choice item is to be used, Scarf is the most common, because it can serve as a sweeper itself in the late game. And in the case of Scarfers like Moxie Salamence or Beast Boost Kartana, they can also boost their attack upon getting a KO. Pokemon like Breloom or Darkrai and Ubers can also contribute as non-boosting wall breakers, as sleep is close to a KO in many situations, and can just about compensate for the fact that you've sacrificed a Pokemon so early in the game. Once they've gotten their sleep off, the game is close to 5-5, but the hyper offense team has the hazard advantage and momentum. Alternatively, a Pokemon can also provide some sort of support or utility, so long as it doesn't ease up on the gas offensively. In fact, support is extremely helpful to further enhance the danger of the sweepers. You just have to make sure that said support is coming from threatening Pokemon. For instance, in Gen 5, Starmie's Rapid Spin is excellent support for Dragonite and Volcarona, and Starmie itself exerts a great deal of offensive pressure, as made most famous by Gen 5's most well-known weatherless offense team. Meanwhile, in Gen 6, Superior manages both boosting and support. Its contrary Leaf Storms are threatening, but it also provides wall breaking with Taunt, and often even dual screens. There are also multiple instances across multiple generations of Pokemon like Latias and Jirachi using Healing Wish, or even Cresselia using Lunar Dance on teams like this, to revitalize a boosting sweeper when needed. Finally, you can't just haphazardly throw your boosters at the opponent with no rhyme or reason to the choices. I mean, you can, you just won't be consistent. The final aspect is especially key, and actually brings us to a significant aspect of the no-switch hyper offense playstyle. What are the downsides to hyper offense? How can it be used skillfully? The biggest flaw with committing to a no-switch strategy is a lack of flexibility if things don't go according to plan, or if the matchup isn't quite as ideal as you'd like. Either you run out of steam too quickly, if you misapply your offensive pressure and your opponent is able to slow the game down a bit, plant their foot, so to speak, as opposed to the proverbial back foot the hyper offense team relies on keeping them on. Or even worse, you don't have a chance to get going in the first place. If their early offense comes from the unending pressure of the multiple attackers put together, progressing in one constant forward movement, hyper offense teams tend to struggle to regain ground if they ever lose it. It's not impossible, as sometimes your opponent will just naturally be weak enough to your Swords Dance Scizor or what have you for that bailout option to become available late game. But that's not what the hyper offense team should count on. Hyper offense teams have been called mindless, accused of dumbing the game down, of encouraging the worst in Pokemon, simply spamming strong attacks with no thought beyond it. Going blood simple, as the Coen brothers might say. The thing is, it works. You can definitely be rewarded for simply following the flowchart sometimes anyway. To be consistent though, or to win even when the matchup isn't quite so ideal, hyper offense demands its user to be extremely on top of things. If you don't properly assess the opponent's team and sequence your sweepers in the right order, knowing what to sacrifice, what to preserve, and when, you may fail to break certain defensive cores, or you might break the defensive core, but you'll have lost the pieces you needed to save yourself from getting cleaned up by the choice scarfers at the end of the match. As simple as hyper offense's rocks, boost, attack strategy seems, and can be, in certain matchups, the style requires pinpoint accuracy when it counts, when it's challenged. Anyone can fluke their way to a win, the way one might if their opponent just happens to get rolled by Volcarona, or a single flinch from Gyarados, but while some teams automatically collapse to the pressure, others are far more well-equipped, and while it is certainly a characteristic of the competitive Pokemon player to blame an impossible matchup as soon as their team doesn't have an auto win against the opponents, to do so with a high-risk style like hyper offense makes using it almost pointless unless you really like gambling. It's tempting to view things this way since hyper offense presents a unique sort of extreme and how it does offer some truly brainless wins, but in most matchups, the hyper offense player must make the opponent's collapse happen more actively, identifying the opponent's pressure points, their weak spots, how if Dragonite is sacrificed to overwhelm Slandorous Therian, then suddenly the late game will open up. Of course, a great part of this comes in the team builder. To get the most out of a hyper offense team, you have to know how your team members work in tandem, and how to translate that against what the opponent has to try and stop you, with just about zero room for error. Fast games, low turn counts, lack of flexibility, and things go wrong with such a determinately necessarily rigid playstyle. You basically have to map out entire games sometimes. It necessitates laser precision, and this brings us to the final part of the video, as this theorem is named after Aerodactyl, the most iconic sacrificial taunt stealth rock lead. It originated in Gen 4, but whenever a hyper offense team in the future generation needed such a lead, Aerodactyl was always there. Azelf is quite close behind and had similar cross-generational use, but Aerodactyl is much faster, and thus beats it head-to-head, meaning that whenever Azelf would get too popular, Aerodactyl would once again rear its rocky head. Azelf's main strength was Explosion, and even post-Boom nerf in Gen 5, greater offense strength and versatility, but Aerodactyl was deceptively excellent in this regard. Though you almost couldn't go wrong with its standard Sash variant, it also adapted many times over the years and tiers. When Machamp was at its apex in Gen 4, Aerodactyl donned Power Herb Sky Attack and deleted it ridiculously hard. It could also utilize Double Edge with minimized bulk IVs to boot, to more easily drop to its Sash and KO itself as to block would-be Rapid Spin KOs from Starmie. It could also toy with the speed-lowering Rock Tube to set up its teammates more efficiently, and in Gen 6 OU, it even adopted a physically defensive Rocky Helmet set to survive Excadrill's Iron Hands and foil its would-be Rapid Spins. When it was first used in Gen 4 OU, Aerodactyl was actually not even officially in the tier, but its talents of being the fastest user of Stealth Rock and Taunt in the game, after the Deoxys forms anyway, single-handedly launched the Hyper Offense playstyle as we know it into existence. It was first utilized on a team named Astral Projection by a legendary player named Husk back at the tail end of Diamond and Pearl. Yes, Diamond and Pearl, meaning even Platinum had not come out yet. So it was a very different metagame. Most notably, Garchomp and even Deoxys Speed were actually allowed at the time, and both featured on the team. Astral Projection was very different from the Hyper Offense teams to follow, as it only has two boosting sweepers, Gyarados and Lucario, and even has a Choice Bander in Garchomp, though this is compensated for by Deoxys Speed functionally having the speed of a Choice Scarfer. Furthermore, the ethos of switching as little as possible wasn't quite there yet. However, the core tenet of the team is the same. Early game Aerodactyl taunts, rocks, and sets the stage for Dragonette's Gyarados. It could be used today. In fact, it is. Aerodactyl became so popular in this role, it rose to OU. It became the defining lead, much like how Hippowdon leads unanimously announced a stall team behind it. There was no mystery as to what you were getting into when you faced an Aerodactyl lead. You were getting absolutely barraged by one setup sweeper after another. Now, as fast as Astral Projection was, there is a reason Husk had such incredible success with it, and the hordes of others using the team didn't. It was far from being an auto-win generator of a team, instead actually demanding an incredibly high level of execution. That's Hyper Offense for you. Now, at the time it was made, Hyper Offense wasn't established by that name, but it inspired legions of similar teams. Eventually, in Platinum, Stathakis' Greek team helped establish and define Hyper Offense, often referred to synonymously as Heavy Offense, along with the premise of not only not predicting, but not switching. Since then, across many metagames, many similar teams have been made, all with the same goal: switch as little as possible, ideally not at all. And thank you so much to our Platinum patrons. Thank you to Amphozenus, Alex Sable, Anthony Belval Renault, Daniel Isbeast, Corman, Eric Dissing, Funky, Glitcherton, Hal, Jack G, King Yabber, Nightfall, Megamon VGC, Mojo Game Slayer, Nurse Jake, One Penguin to Rule, Pretzel SP, Sojiro Sakura, Spavoon, Gylaria, Soros and Croxit, Shiwei Miji, Stoneface Colin, Kiboflu, Wardeen, Zathor, for their major support of our videos.
This is one of the most powerful jet engines in the world.
Why are we not shooting this guy? Oh. There's no way they're not playing a second defensive thing that can save them the game here. Surely I lose, right? They added both to hand. Yeah. I have 3 cards. No!
Runs at temperatures 250 degrees Celsius hotter than the melting point of the materials that make it.
That's 1200 degrees.
So the question is, why doesn't a jet engine just melt into a puddle?
We are right at the boundaries of the laws of physics.
As well, it's at the same temperature now as it would be inside the jet engine. But here they're liquid.
Every time I get on a plane, I'm thinking this is never going to work.
And yet, it does work. Right now, there are over 10,000 planes in the sky powered by engines just like these. Maybe you are on one right now. So, how do they work?
Would be
This
cool
is
if
a
I
jet
was.
engine, specifically a turbofan engine. At the front is this giant fan. During takeoff, these rotating blades push 1.3 tons of air backwards every second, and around 10% of that air gets compressed. The compressors force the air into increasingly narrow chambers. They compress the air to about 50 times atmospheric pressure. And just by doing that, the air heats up to around 600 degrees Celsius. This compressed air is then forced into the combustion chamber, where fuel is sprayed in through a ring of nozzles and ignited. That chemical reaction gives off a lot of heat, so the temperature jumps to around 1500 degrees Celsius. So now you've got this high pressure gas from the combustor that just wants to expand, and now it's got an incredible amount of thermal energy. But between the combustion chamber and the outside air is this: rows of turbine blades. So in order for the gas to expand and get out, it needs to push these turbine blades out of the way. And in pushing the blades, that is how it transfers its energy to the engine. This is where all the power really comes from. In modern jets, on takeoff, each high-pressure turbine blade is generating as much power as a Formula One car. And there are 68 of them.
Yellow teeth not pithy?
And there are 68 of them. As the gas rushes through the turbine and nozzle, its pressure drops from around 50 atmospheres down to 1, and it expands by almost 20 times. And that spins these turbine blades up to 12,500 revolutions per minute. The fan that is pushing all that air backward and all those compressors that squeeze the air down, all of that is powered by the turbines back here. It's a kind of funny, really counterintuitive way to think about an engine. It's what's happening in the back that's actually driving everything up front. As the hot exhaust gas is shot out the back of the engine, it pushes the engine forward. That generates thrust. But did you know that in a modern passenger jet, this accounts for less than 20% the thrust of the engine? The vast majority of the thrust, over 80% of it, just comes from that big fan at the front of the jet. Remember how only 10% of the incoming air gets compressed? The other 90% bypasses all that. It's simply propelled backwards by the fan. It goes right around the guts of the engine and comes straight out the back. The fan pushes that air backwards, so the air pushes the fan forwards. That's how you get 80% of the thrust. It's basically a huge ducted propeller. So why do it this way? I mean, why not compress all the incoming air and put it all through the combustion chamber and turbines? Well, some fighter jets do exactly this, and it makes for very powerful engines, but they're also horribly inefficient. To see why, remember that the impulse pushing the plane forward is equal to the change in the momentum of the air backwards. So you've got options. For example, you could push twice as much air back half as fast, Or you could push half as much air back twice as fast. Both will generate the exact same impulse, but the kinetic energy of the air is proportional to v squared. So it takes 4 times as much energy to speed up the air in the second case, and a lot of that energy is just wasted in the exhaust. So ideally, you want to push as much air backwards as possible with only a small change in velocity. That's why jets have gotten bigger and bigger over the years. And the increasing fraction of bypass air has the added benefit that it surrounds the hot exhaust gases, and that reduces noise coming away from the jet. But there is another major factor when it comes to engine efficiency, and that is temperature. At cruising altitudes around 35,000 feet, the outside air is around negative 55 degrees Celsius, while inside the engine, it's over 1,500 degrees Celsius. The hot, high-pressure gas inside the engine wants to expand into the much colder, lower-pressure air outside. It's that difference that lets the engine turn heat into useful work. But there's a fundamental limit to how much work any heat engine can get from that. It's called the Carnot efficiency. It's equal to 1 minus the temperature of the cold outside air divided by the temperature of the hot gas inside the combustion chamber. So, looking at this, you can improve the efficiency of the engine in 2 ways. Either fly where the air is colder, or raise the temperature in the combustion chamber. One problem with that, though, is that it turned the inside of a jet engine into one of the harshest environments we have ever built, in which machinery has to survive.
To keep a turbine blade whole and unaffected within an engine is like putting an ice cube inside your oven, turning up to max, leaving for work, coming back after an 8-hour shift, and finding it's still completely frozen in the oven. That's what we've got to try and do within that engine.
It sounds absurd. Not only do the turbine blades sit in a stream of gas that's over 1,500 degrees Celsius, they're also spinning at 12,500 RPM, with the tip of each blade slicing through the air at nearly 1,900 kilometers per hour. Now, every blade wants to fly straight, but it's forced to spin in a circle, which means something has to be constantly pulling it inwards. That's the centripetal force. If you take a representative 300-gram high-pressure turbine blade and run it at that speed and radius, it has to be pulled inwards with a force equal to the weight of 20 metric tons. That's roughly the weight of 2 London double-decker buses tugging on each blade as it spins, all while they're glowing hot. To make matters worse, at these temperatures, oxygen wants to react with the metal of the blades itself. And on top of all that, the air rushing through the engine often carries dust, sand, and pollutants that can damage and erode the surfaces inside. And somehow, these blades have to survive this punishment for tens of thousands of flight hours without deforming, cracking, or failing. They really determine how efficient you can make the engine, because you can't make the engine so hot that the blades can't withstand that temperature. So they determine the maximum temperature of the combustion chamber, and therefore the maximum efficiency you can realize with a jet engine. So what kind of metal could possibly survive these conditions? Well, we sent Veritasium producer Amelia to the Department of Materials Science and Metallurgy at Cambridge University to put some different metals to the test.
So this is the steel.
This is the steel sample, yes.
Okay.
So we've got about 200 megapascal to start with, which is sort of comparable to some of the stresses seen by these components in real applications. And we're going to put that stress on and then slowly increase the temperature.
This is a mild steel. It's relatively strong and easy to form into complex shapes. It seems like a pretty good bet for a turbine blade. And at first, under this load and at these low temperatures, it holds up pretty well. We're essentially tugging on all the atoms within the metal. We're not breaking or forming any bonds. We're just making them flex a little, and that slightly changes the spacing between the atoms, and as a result, the metal gets slightly longer. This resulting change in size, specifically the per unit change in length, is what we call strain. Critically, at this stage, the material is behaving elastically. If we remove the load right now, the material just snaps back to its original size. In an engine, some elastic deformation like this will occur. It can't be too big or it'll cause problems. But what we really don't want is plastic deformation, if the shape changes permanently. And that's exactly what starts to happen as we keep increasing the temperature.
It's getting hot now. That's a little bit of oxide. There you go. See this starting to deform?
Now, bonds are breaking and reforming as the metal lattice deforms permanently. But this doesn't happen all at once. So I got the mechanical engineer on our team, Henry, to build this demo.
Okay, so you can see we're getting a bunch of tiny little bubbles, and just naturally they're packing into this hexagonal arrangement. And there are actually a lot of materials that have atomic structures just like this. But you can see it's not perfect. Like right here, you can see there's an extra half plane of atoms. Well, in this case, bubbles. This is called an edge dislocation. It becomes really interesting when I try to pull this raft apart. You can see these little dark lines that zip back and forth. Those are dislocations, and they move through the lattice. As the dislocation moves, it'll cause one plane of bubbles to shear past the other one, which shifts the structure by exactly one spacing. But there isn't just one dislocation. There are plenty of them, and altogether their movement produces dramatic changes in the overall shape.
That's exactly what's happening here. Everywhere that stress is high enough, billions of dislocations are moving and interacting. The steel starts to deform continuously under this constant load in a process called creep. It takes energy to break the atomic bonds as a dislocation travels through the lattice, so as we ramp up the temperature and all the atoms get more thermal energy, it no longer requires as much stress to break these bonds. It becomes much easier for the dislocations to move. The metal effectively gets softer. Now the steel's strength drops so much that the slow, time-dependent creep gives way to rapid deformation. As it stretches, it rapidly decreases in cross-section, and eventually the remaining metal can no longer bear the load. Now you could try doing similar tests for other metals, like this titanium alloy. Titanium is about half as dense as steel.
Should feel that's quite a bit lighter.
Yeah, it's like loads lighter.
So if we were to make turbine blades out of titanium, each blade would be much lighter, and that would reduce the enormous centripetal forces it would experience. So it seems like a great choice. And at first, it performs really well.
That's 100 degrees. Just hang it in there.
But as we push the temperature higher,
Oh, I can see some glowing. Oh, look at it. Oh, it's gone already.
just like the steel, its strength drops rapidly as temperature increases, and that's true for most metals. Yet the first jet engine dating back all the way to 1941 actually did use steel turbine blades. It was designed by British pilot and engineer Frank Whittle. His engine powered the first flight of a British jet aircraft, the Gloucester E-2839 prototype. When a colleague excitedly told Whittle, "Frank, it flies," he dryly quipped, "That was bloody well what it was designed to do, wasn't it?" But Whittle's prototype had two major flaws. The first was that the gas inside the engine only reached temperatures of around 780 degrees Celsius, which was one of the reasons it was inefficient. And the second was that it was only allowed to fly for up to 10 hours. Any longer, and it was too likely parts inside the engine would fail. And both of these drawbacks were largely due to the steel turbine blades.